Okay.
Anybody home?
Yes, we are.
Great. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning to you, sir.
Lesolile Morana Baptist.
It's only the Malas. It's only the Mr. Again.
Hey. Kawana mole hau hau. Mira lewo.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Chairperson, I think we are ready to start. Let me just confirm Portuguese interpretation. Are you ready? Thank you, French.
Tá ótimo.
And Portuguese, French.
Bom dia, muito bem. Perfeitamente. Bom dia, caros colegas. Bom dia, secretário. Aproveito esta ocasião para desejar boas-vindas ao nosso colega deputado Mafa de Lesotho. Saudando-lhe, dizer bem-vindo. Esperamos que venha dar o seu contributo nesta comissão, que é a Comissão da Democratização, Desenvolvimento e Direitos Humanos. Passo agora a convidar o secretário para apresentar as credenciais dos delegados e confirmar o quórum para a reunião.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and good morning, honorable members. Chairperson, we have Botswana, Honorable Lisedi, in the meeting. We have a new member from Lesotho, Honorable Dasala Mafa. We also have another new member, Honorable Christopher Tsiliva from Madagascar. This is his first committee meeting besides the pre-election mission to Zambia. Then we have Honorable Gumba, DS Gumba from Malawi, yourself, Chairperson, from Mozambique, and the Vice Chairperson, Honorable Bergman from South Africa, and then Honorable Maulana Maseko from Eswatini, and Honorable Doughty Dwayne from Zimbabwe. We also have received apologies from Angola, Honorable Diakite, DRC, and Mauritius, Seychelles, where we have a new member, and Zambia. We do not have the parliaments of Namibia and Tanzania, as the parliaments are yet to be constituted after the last election. Chairperson, I also wish to inform the committee that we do have observers who are in the House. In addition to our two resource persons, Professor Maduku and Justice Dingake, we also have representatives of the media. We also have representatives from Oxfam International Southern African Office. I hand over to you, Chairperson.
Muito obrigado, senhor secretário da nossa comissão. Agora passo a apresentar a agenda e submeter para a sua aprovação. Temos como nosso ponto de agenda o papel do Parlamento na proteção do constitucionalismo e do Estado de Direito na África Austral, perspectivas e desafios. Este é o tema que vai nortear a nossa agenda de trabalho do dia de hoje. Passo agora a submeter a vossa consideração. Quem vota nessa agenda? Caros colegas, acho que a agenda foi distribuída e apresentada. Sim. Zimbabwe.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I move for the adoption of the agenda.
Muito obrigado, Zimbabwe, pela ação. Quem apoia? Quem apoia? Swatini.
Thank you. I duly second. You get me? Hello?
Muito obrigado, Swatini, por apoiar. Está aprovado a nossa agenda.
Thank you.
Antes de entrarmos na nossa agenda, convido agora o vice-presidente da comissão para usar a palavra. Senhor deputado, por favor.
Chair, thank you very much. I rise to read a motion of support I rise to table the following motion in support for our fellow country Mozambique and our colleagues and fellow countrymen and women by calling on our committee to reiterate the importance of peace and security in Mozambique and SADC region for human and security and economic democratic consolidation and economic developments, to recall the motion adopted by the 48th plenary that called on SADC to provide backup to Mozambique to curtail the rebels, to welcome the decision by the SADC double troika to immediately deploy back up to the Mozambique army, to reiterate the importance of preserving life and for swift action to subdue the insurgents and ensure a return to normalcy for the ordinary people and for commerce and trade, and to request the chairperson to affirm the same in her opening remarks on behalf of the committee. I hereby move. Thank you.
Faz a favor.
Yes, Chair. The chair is muted.
Sim.
Sure. The chair may wish to.
Está.
The chair
Sim, eu convidava o vice-presidente para usar a palavra.
In that petition, please confirm if the chair was able to hear when the vice chairperson raised his point of order and proposed a motion.
Eu ouvi perfeitamente e pensei que tivesse passado a palavra para ele usar a palavra para apresentar a moção.
Vice Chair, you may wish to affirm to the Chair that this is in essence the motion and there will be need for the proposal to be adopted, to be seconded.
Chair, thank you. I have put it in writing on the chat screen. I've moved it, and I hope that someone would second the motion. Thank you.
Zimbábue, pode usar a palavra.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I raise to second the motion moved by the Vice Chair on the situation in Mozambique. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Zimbábue. Apoia. Mais alguém queira? Não é o caso. Sendo assim, está apoiado. Convido o vice-presidente a apresentar a moção.
Chair, thank you. I will just repeat again. The motion says that by calling on our committee to, number one, reiterate the importance of peace and security in Mozambique and the SADC region for human security and economic democratic consolidation and economic development. Two, to recall the motion adopted by the 48th plenary that called on SADC to provide backup to Mozambique to curtail the rebels. Three, to welcome the decision by the SADC double troika to immediately deploy backup to the Mozambique army. Four, to reiterate the importance of preserving life and for swift action to subdue the insurgents and ensure a return to normalcy for the ordinary people and for commerce and trade. And 5, to request the chairperson to affirm the same in her opening remarks on behalf of the committee. I hereby move.
Muito obrigado, senhor vice-presidente, por esta moção. Quem apoia a moção? Zimbábue pediu a palavra, por favor. Zimbabwe.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. In support and seconding the Vice Chair's motion, I wish to reiterate that the situation in northern Mozambique is very unpalatable. As if to push as if it's an impetus to the whole of the SADC region. If you read the reports coming there, the recent escalation of the insecurity has led to fatalities of different nationalities that even come from SADC. So you're reading on the fatalities, you realize they are nationals from almost all countries in the SADC region, as if to say, this is not Mozambique's problem. This is not Mozambique's problem alone. This is SADC's problem. Because the escalation of problems in Mozambique would derail peace in the whole region, Madam Chair. It's never too late, but I personally feel SADC as a region had delayed in intervening. We could have done a lot if SADC had intervened much earlier. But then, like I'm saying, it's never too late to intervene. I'm glad the head of states and government in their last week's meeting have agreed to send technical support to Mozambique to try and assist the situation. So I'm very much in support of the motion and also very pleased that the heads of state and government have moved. Madam Chair, it's not good for the region to wait for external, the Western countries to start, try and assist our region when we are there. As SADC, I think we are capable of handling this problem, and I applaud the heads of state and government for having taken this stance. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Obrigado, deputado Doene. Quem segunda? Caros colegas, quem segunda a aprovação desta moção? Okay.
I see a hand from Eswatini.
Por favor. Por favor, pode fazer uso da palavra.
Thank you very much. Yes, as a member from Eswatini, I think the Vice Chair has moved a very wonderful motion, which is aiming at solving the problems in Mozambique. Mozambique is our sister country, so what is happening in Mozambique has the potential of affecting the whole region. So, as a united bloc, I think we should stand together and make sure that the problem that is started in Mozambique is curtailed as early as possible, because it has the potential of destabilizing the economy of the region of causing political turmoil in the whole region. And you'll find that sooner or later, some people will be flocking from Mozambique and flooding the neighboring countries. So it's going to be a problem that is going to touch the whole region. So I fully second the motion, and how I wish the head of states, could just make sure that this problem is eradicated as soon as possible. Thank you very much for the motion, and as a member from Swatini, I duly second it. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Swatini, pelo apoio. Está aprovada a nossa moção. Quero, em nome de Moçambique, agradecer esta solidariedade dos países irmãos. Faremos chegar aos nossos dirigentes. Muito obrigada. Passo agora a apresentar o meu discurso de abertura.
Chair, through you. Chair, another new member has joined the meeting. Honorable Richard Labros from Seychelles is in the meeting. While I still have the floor, Chair, I wish to inform or advise honorable members and participants that they must, on the bar below the screen, they must select the language of choice, the preferred language for purposes of interpretation. Secondly, Chair, to advise members that this meeting is being live streamed on SADC PF social media platforms, and is also going to be broadcast on DSTV channel 408. And as such, we request the following etiquette relating to television for the members and the participants, namely that members and participants must always have their videos on unless limited by connectivity challenges, and that microphones must remain muted until given the opportunity to speak, and be worried about your background. Make sure that the background and the surroundings are clean. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Muito obrigado, senhor secretário. Desejar boas-vindas à nossa colega. E passo agora a apresentar o discurso de abertura. Prezados membros da Comissão Permanente de Democratização, Governação e Direitos Humanos do Fórum Parlamentar da SADC. Senhora Buenos Gomes, Secretária-Geral do Fórum Parlamentar. Prezado Secretário da Comissão, Senhor Cheonel Coracha e outros funcionários do Secretariado do Fórum Parlamentar da SADC. Nossos distintos palestrantes. Professor Lovimor Maduca, especialista em Direito Constitucional e Desenvolvimento Parlamentar. Emeritíssimo juiz Wangli Dingag, antigo juiz do Tribunal da Relação e do Tribunal Industrial do Botswana, do Tribunal Especial Residual para a Serra Leoa e dos Tribunais Supremo e Nacional da Papua Nova Guiné. Nossos parceiros, Agência Alemã de Cooperação Internacional, GIZ, e Agência Austríaca de Desenvolvimento, ADA. representados pelo Sr. Adam, e a International IDA, representantes das organizações da sociedade civil, representantes dos órgãos da comunicação social, minhas senhoras, meus senhores. É uma honra singular desejar-vos as boas-vindas a esta sessão de desenvolvimento de capacidades da Comissão Permanente de Democratização, Governação e Direitos Humanos do Fórum Parlamentar da SADC, subordinado ao lema: o papel do Parlamento na proteção do constitucionalismo e do Estado de Direito na África Austral, perspectivas e desafios. Esta reunião realiza-se no âmbito da sessão das comissões do Fórum Parlamentar da SADC para a 49ª Assembleia, que será acolhida em formato virtual pelo Parlamento do Botswana em junho do ano corrente. Prezados membros da Comissão e distintos participantes, o constitucionalismo e o Estado de Direito estão no centro de uma democracia sustentável e os parlamentos são o cerne da proteção do constitucionalismo e do Estado de Direito. Para o efeito, os parlamentos devem servir-se do seu mandato constitucional para assegurar a observância dos vários princípios que sustentam o constitucionalismo e o primado de direito. Os referidos princípios incluem a separação de poderes entre o Parlamento, o Executivo e o Judiciário, a independência do Poder Judiciário, as garantias processuais ou processos equitativos para aqueles que forem acusados de ofensas criminais, respeito pelos direitos individuais, responsabilização no processo de governação, igualdade ao abrigo da lei, constituições fortes com limites constitucionais impostos sobre o poder, direitos humanos, um sistema eleitoral eficaz, compromisso para a igualdade de gênero, leis que protegem as minorias e outros grupos vulneráveis e uma sociedade civil forte. Prezados membros da Comissão e distintos participantes, sendo o órgão mais representativo em qualquer democracia, os parlamentos devem não só defender sociedades abertas e democráticas, como também devem servir para garantir que a participação e a consulta dos cidadãos se tornem na característica distinta das políticas públicas e dos processos de tomada de decisões. Afinal, a nossa legitimidade enquanto parlamentares e a do Parlamento deriva diretamente dos pesados membros da Comissão e distintos participantes. Enquanto os parlamentos têm o mandato de promover o constitucionalismo, enfrentam vários desafios a esse respeito. Estes incluem as relações de poder, que muitas vezes põem em causa o princípio da separação de poderes. No seu documento seminal, Marcos de Referência para Parlamentos Democráticos na África Austral, adotado em 2012 sobre a égide desta comissão, o Fórum Parlamentar da SADC fez notar que as jovens democracias da África são ainda caracterizadas pela debilidade dos seus parlamentos e por judiciários com uma independência limitada que devem enfrentar executivos muito dominantes. Na maior parte dos casos, os parlamentos foram reduzidos a instituições essencialmente reativas em vez de proativas e são, em grande medida, incapazes de responder suficientemente aos desafios emergentes, oportunidades e emergências nacionais, como as que são vivenciadas nos nossos respectivos parlamentos durante as paralisações da Covid-19. Prezados membros da Comissão e distintos participantes, gostaria de apelar aos parlamentos da região da SADC para se livrarem do rótulo de carimbarem apenas e se colocarem à altura das circunstâncias através da preservação vigorosa da separação de poderes e dos freios e contrapesos e assegurar que a relação entre os três ramos do governo seja uma de igualdade e independência. Os parlamentos devem ter a consciência do fato de que qualquer usurpação dos poderes de um ramo com um outro tem um efeito adverso sobre o constitucionalismo e o primário de direito. Se os parlamentos se tornarem cúmplices, permitindo o desequilíbrio do poder a favor de um ramo do governo, isto equivaleria a uma traição da confiança pública. Prezados membros da Comissão e distintos participantes, tendo em consideração o que precede o Fórum Parlamentar da SADC, organizou esta sessão de desenvolvimento de capacidade sobre o papel do Parlamento na proteção do constitucionalismo e do primário do direito na África Austral para os deputados membros da Comissão Permanente de Democracia, Governação e Direitos Humanos, membros de outras comissões permanentes do Fórum Parlamentar da SADC e parlamentos nacionais. A sessão vai ao encontro da visão do Fórum de juntos avançarmos como um porta-estandarte da democratização e do desenvolvimento socioeconômico da região da SADC e do objetivo 3 do seu plano estratégico, nomeadamente facilitar o desenvolvimento de capacidade de outros programas de apoio aos deputados e funcionários parlamentares, visando aumentar as competências profissionais, os conhecimentos e outras habilidades para fazer face aos desafios emergentes. Esta sessão tem os seguintes objetivos específicos: aumentar o nível de conhecimento dos deputados sobre os princípios de constitucionalismo e primário de direito no sistema democrático, identificar as oportunidades e os desafios a que os parlamentares fazem face no cumprimento do seu papel de proteger o constitucionalismo e o primário de direito através do intercâmbio de experiências comparativas. Aumentar a capacidade dos parlamentos da SADC de levar a cabo a sua responsabilidade constitucional de defender e protagonizar o constitucionalismo e o primário de direito e criar consenso sobre as áreas prioritárias de ação com vista a reforçar o papel do Parlamento na proteção do constitucionalismo, do primário de direito em todos os Estados-membros da SADC. Prezados membros e distintos participantes, em nome da Comissão e em meu nome próprio, gostaria de expressar os meus sinceros agradecimentos aos nossos dois especialistas, professor Maruco e o meritíssimo juiz Dindak, que nos vão orientar durante a sessão, respectivamente, como palestrantes e intervenientes. Prezados membros da Comissão e distintos delegados, permitam, para concluir, agradecer também aos nossos parceiros, a GZADA, pelo apoio financeiro para esta sessão. Gostaria também de agradecer à Internacional EDA que é o parecer técnico da nossa comissão. Prezados membros da comissão e distintos participantes, permitam-me que eu termine por desejar-lhes deliberações muito frutuosas. Tenho agora a singular hora e o privilégio de declarar oficialmente aberta a sessão de desenvolvimento de capacidades sobre o papel do Parlamento na proteção do constitucionalismo e do Estado de Direito na África Austral. Muito obrigada. Neste momento, passo a convidar o professor Maduco para proferir a sua apresentação. Obrigada.
Chair, through you, while Professor Maduku is taking the floor, may I, through the chairperson, introduce briefly the two resource persons for the information of the committee. Professor Maduku is a professor of law at the University of Zimbabwe. He obtained his LLB from the same university and his master's and PhD degrees from the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom. He is also an active politician in Zimbabwe and a leader of a political party known as the NCA. Justice Dingake, on the other hand, is a judge of the Supreme and National Courts of Papua New Guinea. He is also a judge of the Residual Special Court of Sierra Leone, where he was appointed by the Secretary General of the United Nations in 2013. He is a former judge of the High Court and Industrial Court of Botswana, and he has taught law at the University of Botswana, and has been a visiting scholar at the University of Pretoria, University of Cape Town, and the Institute of Development Labour Law in Rome, Italy. Among many of his credentials, Judge Dingake has also worked with SADC Parliamentary Forum in the development of model law, the model law on eradication of child marriages, the model law on HIV, and the model law, recently the model law on elections. Thank you, Chair. I submit.
All right. If I'm now maybe able to come in, my name is Professor Maduku. I'm sorry it appears that my face is not coming out, but I am sure I'm very, very clear if honorable members can allow me to proceed. All right, do I proceed?
Yes, sir, the chair has given you the floor.
Yes, that's fine. My topic is, as you can see, the role of Parliament in protecting constitutionalism and the rule of law in Southern Africa, prospects and challenges. That is the nature of my topic. The role of Parliament in protecting constitutionalism and the rule of law in Southern Africa, prospects and challenges. It is a very important topic, and I would like to welcome my intervener, Justice Dingake, is a really very respectable judge that I know very much, and I believe he will do justice to his intervention. Chair, you will obviously indicate when my time is up for purpose of the first session. But allow me to say this at the beginning. When you look at that topic, the role of Parliament in protecting constitutionalism and the rule of law in Southern Africa, prospects and challenges, you will find that there are 6 elements that immediately come to mind, 6 things that immediately come to mind. And I hope that we take note of that. And there are very simple things coming out. The first one is that there exists an institution called the Parliament. That's number one, because we are talking about the role of Parliament. So there is a thing called Parliament. Number two, there is also a set of things called the constitutionalism and the rule of law. So that is number two. There would be constitutionalism and the rule of law. Number three, that Parliament has a role to play in these things called constitutionalism and rule of law. All these things are coming from the topic. Then number four, that one of the specific roles of Parliament is to protect constitutionalism and the rule of law. Because our topic is the role of Parliament in protecting constitutionalism. So it means in terms of the topic, there is a specific role for Parliament, which is that of protecting these institutions. Then number five, that there are some prospects and challenges regarding these aspects that we are going to be discussing. Then finally, number six, we must restrict ourselves to Southern Africa. Those 6 aspects are what will guide my presentation. I just want to quickly repeat those. That there is such a thing called Parliament, which is an institution. Number 2, that there are concepts of constitutionalism and rule of law. Number 3, that Parliament has a role to play in respect of constitutionalism and rule of law. Number 4, that one of those specific roles that Parliament has is one of protecting these aspects. Then number 5, that there are prospects and challenges. And then we restrict ourselves to Southern Africa. I go into the substance. We must begin by defining constitutionalism and the rule of law. What is meant by constitutionalism? What is meant by rule of law? When we give a proper definition to these elements, we will already begin to see what Parliament can do about them if we properly define what is meant by constitutionalism and what is meant by rule of law. I will begin by defining constitutionalism. Constitutionalism. What is it? The easiest way of understanding constitutionalism is first that there is a constitution in place which has rules and provisions, that we must abide by the constitution, that we must follow the constitution, that we must always be guided by the constitution. That is an easy way of saying constitutionalism refers to a state of affairs where we follow our constitution, where we go by what our constitution says, where we ensure that what is in the constitution is followed and is guiding us as a society. That is the first understanding. But that understanding is not enough. Constitutionalism goes beyond that. Constitutionalism goes beyond following our constitutions and ensuring that our constitutions are in fact followed. It goes to cover also that we must follow our constitutions provided the constitution itself has good provisions, or the constitution limits the exercise of power, that the constitution ensures that there is no abuse of power. So constitutionalism, therefore, refers to a belief in the concept of ensuring that there is limited governmental power, that there are checks and balances in the exercise of power. If a constitution provides for checks and balances, then constitutionalism is already respected to the extent that we follow the provisions of the constitution. But if a constitution does not provide for these checks and balances, then it is not enough simply to follow the constitution and say we are abiding by constitutionalism. In other words, if you have a very undemocratic constitution, or if you have a constitution that is very oppressive and you follow it, that is not constitutionalism. Constitutionalism requires you to follow a constitution that has provisions that provide for checks and balances. That is the concept of constitutionalism. Now, when we define it that way, we will find that the concept of constitutionalism is in the same field with the concept of the rule of law. I'll tell you which one is above the other. The rule of law refers to the situation where we follow the law, that we do not do things that are outside the law. We will always ensure that there must be a law in place before we can exercise power. That power is derived from the law. And we must always ensure that we follow the law. That the rights of citizens are protected by law. If we define the rule of law that way, we will also say that it is not every law that respects the rule of law. If you have very oppressive laws, very undemocratic laws, very laws that are unjust, and you follow them to the letter, you will not be going by the rule of law. If you pass a law that is very undemocratic, very draconian, very much taking away the rights of citizens, and you say, I'm following the law, we are going by the rule of law. When you are going by the rule of oppressive law, it will not be rule of law. The rule of law requires you to have good, just laws, and then you follow them. Now, if I define the rule of law that way, it would mean that both the rule of law and constitutionalism belong to the set of rules that with the constitutionalism, we must follow the Constitution and be guided by good constitutional principles. Rule of law, we must follow the law and be guided by good laws. This means that the concept of the rule of law is a bigger term, it's broader than the concept of constitutionalism. The rule of law would refer to any law that also includes constitutional law. So you are better off using the term rule of law to cover also constitutionalism. In other words, you have rule of law, which requires that the law, the most important law, is the Constitution. The supreme law of any land will be called the Constitution. So if you go by the rule of law, you will be going also by constitutionalism. I mean, similarly, for other people that want to prefer the term constitutionalism, whenever there is constitutionalism, there will also be rule of law. So I think that the use of these terms is because of the current vocabulary in democratic fields, that we prefer to say constitutionalism and rule of law, or rule of law and constitutionalism. It's really a preference of the modern discourse, but either term would satisfy what we want to achieve. Now, having defined these terms, I think Madam Chair, if I'm very clear, by rule of law, we mean a state of affairs where we go by the law, but provided that law is somewhat a law that satisfies certain minimum requirements. Where we go by constitutionalism, we must follow the Constitution, provided the Constitution satisfies certain minimum requirements. Not every Constitution satisfies constitutionalism. Not every law satisfies rule of law. So it is a law that satisfies minimum requirements, and it is a constitution that satisfies minimum requirements. So for this presentation, this session, and the next session after lunch, I would prefer that we use these terms, particularly rule of law, to cover everything, including constitutionalism. Now, having defined these terms, I'm sure I can go to the topic, the role of Parliament. Chair, I believe that I should also define Parliament, so that we are very clear as to what we mean by Parliament. Parliament is an institution. It is an organ of state that has a specific responsibility in the state, which responsibility makes it a distinct entity, separate from its members, Parliament is not the same thing as members of Parliament. Members of Parliament are one thing, Parliament is another. In other words, Parliament exists as an institution separate from its members, but it consists of members of Parliament. But members of Parliament are not Parliament. They are separate, they remain separate. Parliament exists on its own as an organ of state that has a responsible political role of making laws, of ensuring that there are checks and balances, of ensuring that those other organs of state comply with the Constitution and the rule of law. So I am just here to say that Parliament is not the same thing as its members. They are separate. When you conceive of Parliament, look at a company, an institution. A company is made up of its various members, but though it's a separate legal entity called the Parliament, it's a separate political entity which exists with or without members at any one stage. There will be an institution called the Parliament. Now, can I now go to the role of Parliament in protecting this? These ones I will number the roles so that the honorable members here will be able to follow, and also that Justice Tingake will be able to make useful comments. And I'm going to be numbering these. Having taken care of the definitions, I am able now to get into the role, and I will number them. The first role of Parliament in protecting constitutionalism and the rule of law. First role is, I will summarize it as follows. It is the role of ensuring that there is separation of powers. Role number one is the role of ensuring that there is separation of powers. I want honorable members to understand this, that when we get to the other specific roles like legislating and so forth, those other roles must be separated from the key role of Parliament, which is to ensure that there is separation of powers. Separation of powers is a state of affairs where the state has three distinct organs: the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, that these organs must be kept apart, that to ensure that you have a real democracy, real liberty, real issues, you ought to ensure that those organs stay apart. Each organ stays in its role: legislature, executive, and the judiciary. But I am saying and putting across this position in this lecture or in this presentation that it is Parliament that must ensure that there is separation of powers. It is not going to be the role of the executive or just also the role of the judiciary. Each of these organs has a responsibility to ensure that there is separation of powers. But I want to put it across that Parliament has this primary responsibility of ensuring that there is separation of powers. And how does it ensure that there is separation of powers? Parliament ensures that there is separation of powers by refusing to be a rubber stamp of the executive. You see, I think as honorable members, when you get to the judiciary, you all be told that the judiciary is independent and that it must be independent, that judges must not, be bulldozed into other. It remains. This is not an issue for the judiciary alone. Parliament must also be independent. It must say we are Parliament and we do the work of Parliament. That role, I have decided to call that role the role of ensuring that there is separation of powers. You will see in the other various roles that, to ensure that there is separation of powers, you obviously have to do certain things. Now, how do we ensure that there is separation of powers? We ensure by refusing to be a rubber stamp. But we ensure most prominently by developing a mindset that says we are an independent body. We are not a rubber stamp of the executive, that we are not there to do the role of the judiciary, and this is what, and so forth. Parliament must never allow a state of affairs where it is like the executive in Parliament. This is the point I'm making. So that's role number one. In the discussion, I think I can put it more and more, but the point I'm making is that Parliament is there to ensure that there is separation of powers. And you ensure separation of powers by reminding the other organs that we are Parliament and we have a role separate from you. And that role we must play it alone as Parliament. That's number one. Then we come to role number two of Parliament. Role number two is the specific role called legislating. That Parliament is there to legislate. This is common all over the world, that whenever you have a Parliament, it is there as a law-making organ. But making law must be taken in the context of these aspects, constitutionalism and rule of law. So I am looking at role number two, which is legislating. But that role of legislating has so many key ingredients that will ensure that we promote constitutionalism and the rule of law. And I will indicate those ingredients. So for purpose of following my presentation, Madam Chair, you will say role number one is the role of ensuring that there is separation of powers. And I've said clearly that it must be looked at as a separate role, as a role that is there to say, I have a mindset that I am an independent institution. And members of Parliament must know that they exist separate from other institutions. Secondly, the role of legislating, which is of course assumed by separation of powers. But in legislating, you have so many elements in legislating that ensure that you protect constitutionalism and the rule of law. And I'm going into these separate elements now. But these separate elements fall under role number two, which is the role of legislating. And under that legislating, you have these elements that I now point out under role number two. Madam Chair, I hope I don't leave anyone behind. We are in role number two, which is legislating, but that role number two has several components that ensure that Parliament can protect constitutionalism and the rule of law. All right, I go to those elements under legislating. One, ensuring that you don't over-delegate an element called delegated legislation. Some parliaments around the world do nothing. They go there to delegate. They go there to pass laws which says that we are making this law and we are leaving it to the minister to do the rest. They go to the next, we are making this law, we are leaving it to the president to do the rest. In other words, what Parliament there does is to simply make a law that delegates its powers. Now, under that element, Parliament must not over-delegate. In other words, it must not abdicate its responsibility of making law. So I would say that do not abdicate your primary law-making power. Where Parliament sits and then doesn't make the law that ought to be made, only makes enabling law and says we are leaving it to the executive, then Parliament there will be failing to do constitutionalism and the rule of law. In other words, over-delegating is an abdication of responsibility, and that is not good lawmaking process. Then number two, the element number two under legislating is that Parliament must ensure that the laws it makes, the content of the law that it makes, is a law that protects rights of citizens, is a law that does not cross the boundary, is a law that clearly is within the confines of a good law. So that is number two. Parliament in making law must specialize in ensuring that the content of the law that is made is in, and so forth. If I look at the Constitution, I would read to you Section 86 of the Constitution of Botswana. It says that subject to the provisions of this Constitution, Parliament shall have power to make laws for the peace, order, and good government of Botswana. This is the kind of rule that you see in many other constitutional formulations. But there I'm going into content. Parliament must take a lot of effort into scrutinizing the kind of proposals that are being made into law. Does this make sense? What is this provision saying? What is its meaning? What will be its impact? In other words, during the committee stages in Parliament, when you scrutinize bills clause by clause, it is the role of Parliament to ensure that the laws that are passed, they pass some level of scrutiny, which is to ensure that you promote the rule of law. Let's say Parliament is called upon to pass a law that monitors the media, for example. It is sensible for Parliament to look at the nature of that law, the content of that law, and say, is this the kind of extent that we want to go in monitoring the media? So you are looking at the content. If Parliament is asked to pass a law that creates a crime, cyber crime, and so forth, Parliament must scrutinize it and say, is this the kind of law that we would want to have? If Parliament is called upon to pass a law on business, regulating businesses and so forth, it must go into the content. So it's number 2 under legislating. Number 1 was do not over-delegate. You must not abdicate your law-making responsibility by giving too much power to the executive to make subsidiary law. Number 2, go into the content of the law. Look at what the law is and scrutinize it to ensure that that is done. Then element number 3 is that Parliament must ensure public participation in lawmaking processes. Now, most constitutions in Southern Africa do have an element where Parliament, after it has been seized with a bill to be law, it must consult the public. It must take that bill to the public. Let the public get its inputs into it, and then Parliament considers that law after hearing what the public has to say about the content of the law. So Parliament must ensure public participation in the lawmaking process. The Constitution of South Africa, the Constitution of Zimbabwe, and so forth, they have some specific provisions that are drawn that ensure that you have a public participation. If one looks at the constitutions I'm referring to, you'll get a specific provision that tells you what Parliament must do in its process of ensuring that it is making law. Here, I would say that you need to ensure as a Parliament that there is public participation in the process of lawmaking. Then I also move on to say number 4, that Parliament must develop internal mechanisms of ensuring compliance with the Constitution. It must develop internal mechanisms. These internal mechanisms might require Parliament to establish a committee that scrutinizes or analyzes proposed legislation to ensure its compliance with the Constitution, or to ensure its compliance with certain other principles, and then report to the whole Parliament. One example I can give is what happens in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has a special internal mechanism of a parliamentary committee that that scrutinizes proposed legislation. It is called the Parliamentary Legal Committee. The Parliamentary Legal Committee is actually a committee that is set up to ensure that every bill must comply with certain constitutional principles. And then if the bill is not in compliance with those constitutional principles, then the bill must not go through Parliament, because in that case, it is a bill that will contravene the Constitution. So on that number 4 item, I am saying that there must be internal mechanisms of Parliament to control the content of the legislation. Then number 5, it is the issue of providing scope for the initiation of legislation by organs other than the executive. You know that most parliaments operate on the basis of what is coming from the government of the day. It is the government of the day that introduces legislation, introduces bills. There is very limited scope for ordinary members of parliament to bring in legislation. But yet the constitutions in all these countries, they provide for scope for members, ordinary members, to be able to bring in bills into parliament. Now, that element has not been properly taken into account to ensure that parliament creates. So the proposal, the position I'm making is that parliament must fully utilize this scope. There is every parliament in Southern Africa scope for a private member's bill. In other words, an ordinary member of parliament to introduce a bill. There is also scope for private citizens to have their private rights regulated by parliament. Now, when that happens, that could then be scope for parliament to ensure that it protects constitutionalism and the rule of law. So, Madam Chair, I have covered that second role of parliament, which is legislating. But under legislating, I have given in 5 specific items that fall under legislating, which ensure that parliament is able to protect constitutionalism and the rule of law. And just for purposes of repeating myself and making the point clear, I have said that the 5 elements falling under legislating, it is do not over-delegate. In other words, do not abdicate your law-making powers by over-delegating. Number 2, I've said that Parliament must scrutinize the content of the law and ensure that that law is in line with good principles of law and so on. Number 3, I've said that Parliament must ensure public participation in its processes by taking the bills out there to people. Number 4, I've said that Parliament must have internal mechanisms of ensuring compliance with the Constitution. And I gave the example there of the Parliamentary Legal Committee in Zimbabwe. Under public participation, I've referred to the South African Constitution and so forth. Then fifthly, I've said that Parliament must provide scope for legislation to be initiated by other organs other than the executive, like private members' bills and so forth. Then I go to the third role. I hope I haven't lost, people haven't lost me there. I go to the third role. Remember that my first role is ensuring that there is separation of powers. My second role is legislating. But under legislating, I have 5 items that I put across. Then I go to my third role of Parliament. The third role of Parliament is performing exclusive constitutional roles. Performing exclusive constitutional roles. Almost every constitution sets up certain tasks for Parliament, which are meant to ensure constitutionalism and the rule of law. These tasks are given specifically to Parliament and Parliament alone. Now, those roles must be performed. I will give the example and aspects under that. The first one is a vote of no confidence in the government or in components of the government or in. Now, you know that society trusts Parliament to perform certain roles in its absence. And so when Parliament is sitting and daily doing anything, you need to have a state of affairs where you leave certain things to Parliament. And one of those roles is a vote of no confidence. If the government is not performing, or if the president is not doing certain things that are required of him or her, and so forth, some constitutions in Southern Africa do allow and do give power to Parliament to pass a vote of no confidence in the government or pass a vote of no confidence in the president. When that happens, Parliament must have specific responsibility to do that which the Constitution gives to it. You should not shy away. If the Constitution says anyone can move a motion for a vote of no confidence, that motion can be debated and voted upon, then Parliament must do that. If there is provision for a vote of no confidence in a particular minister who is not performing well, then Parliament must be able to do that. So that's one specific role which is exclusive to Parliament. And when Parliament performs that role, it will be ensuring that there is rule of law and that there is constitutionalism. The second role under the exclusive roles is where Parliament is involved in the appointment processes that are set out in the Constitution. Sometimes the Constitution says that Parliament shall give a list of names to the President or to the Executive. Parliament shortlists names of members of commissions. Parliament shortlists names of members of the Electoral Commission, for example, and so forth. Then Parliament must do that. That Parliament, is involved in the appointment of a public protector, and that this is what Parliament must go through. Or Parliament is involved in interviewing judges in some countries, and so forth. You can see that role is the role of shortlisting candidates or putting across candidates who must then be taken on for appointment. Then there are countries in Southern Africa which are the other way around, where the executive puts across names to Parliament for approval. That it is the president who wants to appoint a chief justice, and so forth. And then he brings the name of a proposed chief justice to Parliament for approval. All this is a specific constitutional role for Parliament, where Parliament is playing a role of appointment. This role is a role of playing checks and balances. It is actually derived from, pioneered by the Americans, the American Senate, which does approvals of, judges, ambassadors, the secretaries of state, things like that, and so on. So that role of shortlisting candidates for appointment and approval of appointments must be taken seriously by Parliament, because it is a role that ensures that Parliament plays its parameters in rule of law and constitutionalism. A third component of that exclusive constitutional role is the impeachment process. Impeachments. Impeachments are very important aspects of the role of Parliament. You want to take out the president from office, or you want to try out the president and have him removed from office. The impeachment process in many of our constitutions is left with Parliament. It is Parliament and Parliament alone that can do an impeachment. Then there's also a role, which is a fourth one, where Parliament may actually itself be electing a president under certain circumstances. I think that is also a clear role. So that is the third role of Parliament, which is an exclusive constitutional role. And these constitutional roles are many, but the examples I have given you are those four: a vote of no confidence in the government or a minister, shortlisting of candidates and approvals for appointments, where Parliament is playing a checks and balances system, impeachments of presidents, then in fact in electing a president. In all these roles, when Parliament performs these roles, it will actually be dealing with protecting constitutionalism and the rule of law. Then I get to the fourth role of Parliament that I want to discuss. It is the oversight role. I'll call that the oversight, monitoring, and accountability law. I'll put it in one basket: the oversight, monitoring, and accountability role. This is a very prominent role of Parliament, and also a role that is generally seen by many as the role that places Parliament within the confines of processes that can clearly show constitutionalism and the rule of law. Now, under the oversight, monitoring, and accountability role, there are several components there that we would need to discuss. I'll need the guidance. I'll just go through them. But I think at this point, after dealing with this, I will stop so that we can have Justice Dingake coming in and then perhaps an open discussion, so that I don't keep on talking and so forth. That's what I believe. So I'll look at that fourth role, give some elements under the fourth role, and then perhaps stop at that stage to give some breather for persons. It can't be on and on and on. Now, the oversight role is a prominent one. It is meant to ensure accountability, and it is Parliament that is given that special responsibility. It starts with the element number 1 of government in Parliament. All our constitutions subject the executive to parliamentary scrutiny by demanding that government comes to Parliament to report on its work, to be questioned around its work, and in fact to ensure that Parliament is informed on behalf of the people. That's what it does. So government in Parliament, when government comes in Parliament, it might make statements and so forth. It might be pushing through legislation. But the role of Parliament there is to question governmental frameworks, to question what government is doing, and subject ministers to accountability. Now, this is the role that ensures constitutionalism, because the purpose of Parliament there is to be the voice of the people in subjecting ministers and others to parliamentary scrutiny. So if ministers are not questioned, or if questions are not robust enough to ensure that ministers are made transparent in their dealings, then it would be a failure of Parliament. So Parliament must play that role critically and be able to do it. The second one is where government is subjected to parliamentary committees. In other words, government departments are brought before various committees of Parliament for scrutiny, for investigation, and to be able to answer questions. This is another constitutional role for Parliament, that those parliamentary committees must be able to perform their work clearly and so forth. Then a third component of that oversight role is what I would refer to as petitions by members of the public. Members of the public are entitled to send petitions to Parliament, requesting that certain things be done, requesting that Parliament subjects the government to certain frameworks and so on. So the petitions by members of the public are another component that ought to be taken into account by Parliament in its work. Then we have Parliament and other constitutional bodies, where Parliament receives reports. What our constitution in Southern Africa says is that these reports shall be laid before Parliament. It might be the Electoral Commission, it might be the Anti-Corruption Commission, it might be the Public Protector, it might be anyone. They are required to lay reports before Parliament. But there's very little that Parliament has been doing in terms of ensuring that the process of having these reports before it, those processes are made to really yield the role of ensuring that there is rule of law and that there is constitutionalism. I'll come to that, I think, in my next presentation. Then there is the question of how Parliament ensures that the judiciary and other elements are working. This is a very sensitive area. The judiciary is independent, but it must be accountable. So there's a difference between the independence of the judiciary and the accountability of the judiciary. So Parliament is the one that plays the role of accountability. Independence of the judiciary, Parliament ensures that independence by putting in place laws that ensure that judges are independent. But then ensuring accountability means that Parliament must allow certain debating issues around the performance of the judiciary. Madam Chair, for now I would prefer that I stop here so that I make a distinction between this session and the next session. I still have other things to say, but for now, those are the presentations I have made. And just to help you from your various areas and also to help Justice Dingake, I will summarize the points that I've made in 1 minute. And I always prefer, you can see that as an academic, as a lecturer, I keep doing this thing of wanting to ensure that people are following what I've said. I started off by defining what is constitutionalism and what is the rule of law. And in both instances, I indicated that it is following a constitution, following the law. But it is not just following every law, it must be a law or a constitution that is conforming to certain minimum standards. A bad constitution will never give us constitutionalism. A bad set of laws will never give us rule of law. So that is very, very important. Rule of law is not just rule of any law. Constitutionalism is just not just following any constitution. But I've also tried to be helpful by suggesting that the term rule of law is a bigger term. It's an umbrella term that also covers constitutionalism. Then from there, I went on to tell you my view that Parliament must also be defined. Parliament does not mean members of Parliament. Yes, members of Parliament constitute Parliament. But Parliament is a separate, standalone institution that exists on its own and that must be respected and with its dignity and its role. Members of Parliament can actually fail Parliament by not doing that which Parliament ought to do. So I defined Parliament saying it must be separated from its members as an institution. Then I went on to look at the roles. I covered 4 roles. My first role was the role of that Parliament must ensure that there is separation of powers. And I deliberately said that is a separate function. And I said it's a mindset, that one. You must have a mindset that says we are not a rubber stamp. A mindset that says we are not an extension of any other organ. We are an independent organ. Then the second role was that of legislating. And under that role of legislating, I put 5 things under it, which are separate and independent and very important. Delegated legislation, you must not abdicate your responsibility, ensure that there is content of law, ensure public participation, have internal mechanisms of ensuring that there is compliance with the Constitution, and finally, give room to other people other than government to initiate legislation and so forth. Then I went to my third role, which I said is the exclusive roles given by Parliament, exclusive constitutional roles. And I gave you examples like a vote of no confidence by Parliament, shortlisting of candidates for appointments. In other words, Parliament playing a role in appointments, and then impeachments and examples electing presidents. And I said under this exclusive constitutional role, Parliament will actually be playing its mechanism of protecting constitutionalism and the rule of law. Then I ended up with the 4th function, which I said oversight, monitoring, and accountability. And under that oversight role, we said the Parliament must flex its muscles. When government comes to Parliament, it must be questioned, and Parliament has a big responsibility there. When government comes before parliamentary committees, it must be questioned and so on. Then give room to petitions by members of the public. Then, of course, Parliament with its role considering reports from other constitutional bodies. And again, Parliament with the judiciary. For now, Madam Chair, that is my presentation. And as I said, I still have more depending on how your program is going to be kicking off now. But I thought I can't go on and on and on. Let me stop at this stage and allow the next session to kick in. Thank you.
Muito obrigada, Dr. Maduco, pela sua apresentação. Passo agora a convidar o Dr. Dingak, o juiz Dingak.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Am I laudable from there? Can you hear me? Hello?
Perfeitamente.
Can you hear me?
Perfeitamente.
Hello?
Sim, pode prosseguir, estou a ouvir perfeitamente.
I can go on. Yes. You can hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. Sorry for the little hiccup. Let me just greet everybody. Say good morning, good afternoon. I'm in Seychelles. I don't know various time zones wherever you may be, and I'm very happy to intervene in this very important and broad topic, and to meet virtually my dear friend Professor Maduk. It has been a long time. The last time we met, you had taken me to some beautiful place in Zimbabwe where it can be extremely cold. I do not remember the name of that place, but it's a beautiful little paradise in Zimbabwe. You'll remember. Let me just say that the topic of which you require me to intervene is very broad, it's massive. And Professor was right to be sensitive about the time he takes to deliberate, because as I see it, we also have to leave some time for members of parliament to engage, so that this is a productive conversation. And so I'll try to be brief as a result, because we must accommodate every other person who may wish to speak on this very important topic. I must start by saying that the professor has been comprehensive and very thorough, and being a scholar, also very scholarly. He has correctly unpacked, starting with the topic, what it entails, unpacked it comprehensively to the very last element, and also comprehensively discussed, defined the concept of constitutionalism and the rule of law. The professor will be first to accept that this topic, to do justice to it, you actually need weeks, not hours, because it's made up of certain elements that on their own may take hours. But I agree entirely with everything that he has said. But for the purposes of my intervention, I want to focus on three things that are implicated by the topic. Some he have mentioned very briefly, but of which I wish to spend some time. And thereafter try to bring all that within the context of SADC PF, what it is doing to advance constitutionalism and the rule of law. I agree firstly with what the professor said about the definition of constitutionalism, especially the emphasis on limited government, on checks and balances, not just following a constitution. Yes, to follow a constitution is important, but to ensure that the laws that are being prescribed by the constitution are good and just laws, and that oppressive or draconian laws cannot satisfy the definition of constitutionalism. We often say in the field that there are many countries that may have constitutions without constitutionalism. In other words, although the constitution may try to place limitations on the exercise of government power and require parliament to exercise some watchdog role and to hold the executive to account, you may find all these things are not happening. So in that kind of situation, we say that we have a constitution with, we may have a constitution without constitutionalism. And I agree with him that rule of law is much broader. It's an umbrella concept, if you like, that also encapsulates constitutionalism. And under the rule of law, there are many elements of the rule of law, and some of the elements he mentioned, and I don't need to go through them, but they include a constitution with constitutional limits of power. They include human rights. They include an effective electoral system. They include commitment to human rights, including gender equality. And they include laws to protect minorities and other vulnerable groups, and fundamental freedoms, and so forth and so forth. So I want to zero in on 4 themes purposefully, being human rights, the independence of the judiciary, some part of good governance, but I locate my intervention very precisely on corruption, because it is one of the issues that is actually against good governance and against the rule of law. Let me therefore start with human rights. The SADC-PF commitment to the rule of law, to constitutionalism, cannot be in doubt. In fact, the formation of SADC is rooted on the values of the rule of law. The SADC Treaty tells us much: democracy, human rights, and good governance. And whilst in the last few years there have been signs of progress with respect to living the above values, there are some scholars who may ascertain with credibility that we have witnessed some kind of deterioration, stagnation, and even regression in some states insofar as deepening constitutionalism, the rule of law, and democracy itself. Under the auspices of SADC and the AU, member states have adopted progressive approaches to address challenges related to constitutionalism, related to good governance, related to the rule of law. And SADC-PF in particular has cut itself a niche over the years to promote this singular path of honoring human rights and assisting members of parliament to protect human rights. And that is one of the things that Professor spoke about, that among many other functions that he articulated eloquently and brilliantly is the question of protecting human rights. And maybe not surprisingly, I as a judge would like to spend some time on that aspect and to bring into the discourse SADC-PF efforts and your efforts as MPs, agreeing with the professor, of course, that there is a difference between parliament and members of parliament. Members of parliament are part of an institution that is prescribed and created by the Constitution, and the Constitution says you shall legislate for the good order, good governance, and peace of a country. The example that he cited from Botswana is one of my favorite. It must be section 86, one of my favorite sections, but it does apply to the broad function of most parliaments. So over the years, in order to protect human rights, which is one of your many functions as MPs, SADC-PF has come up with SADC model laws. I mentioned three that you have participated in passing in order to advance human rights. This one relates to the SADC model law on HIV and AIDS. You'll know about it. The SADC model law on child marriages, ending child marriages, and the SADC model law on elections. There may be, it may well be that those model laws that are simply legislative guides are not binding, they are soft law, some would say, but at least they speak to the commitment of MPs to honor the rights of people. And once they have been passed in the manner that you have done, I think one of your key roles is to ensure domestication of those laws in order that they may then promote the welfare of the people. So as Professor said, and this is important, Professor said it's not every law that would pass the test of constitutionalism or the rule of law. It must be just laws. it must be democratic laws. It must be progressive laws that advance the welfare of the people. And those model laws that I refer to, that the SADC PF has brought MPs to endorse, are part of an attempt to pass good laws. Now, that is insofar as that is concerned. We don't have time. I could go in detail about, but I'm a bit sensitive about allowing other people to speak. So I'll not go into detail with respect to that. But I wanted to bring on board this point very sharply. There is also the question of elections. And I know that the Honorable Professor spoke about one of the other functions is for you to scrutinize reports that are laid before you. This includes reports such as you may get from the Public Protector, from the Electoral Management Body. There is an issue, Honorable MPs, that implicates on constitutionalism and the rule of law in the SADC region around the conduct of elections in SADC countries. Now, the rule of law, among many other things that it requires, I said if we go through all of them exhaustively, it will take weeks. But among many other things that it requires is regular, free, and fair elections. We have seen this being contested in SADC states, including in many countries, in Botswana, in Malawi, in Zimbabwe. Elections have been contested. And one of the recurring themes throughout has been the alleged non-independence of the Electoral Management Body. Now, to have independent management bodies that are not independent is a violation, in my respectful submission, of one of the critical components of the rule of law. So it then behooves members of parliament, when they go back to their respective parliaments, to pass laws that actually promote good governance, promote the rule of law, they promote constitutionalism by ensuring that these electoral management bodies are independent, and that the election disputes that always emerge at the end of the electoral cycle are presided over by judges who are independent. In other words, I am now speaking to the independence of the judiciary as a component of the rule of law. The question of the independence of the judiciary in the region is a matter of some grave concern. It may be time for members of parliament to review and standardize the manner in which judges are appointed to ensure the independence that is required, that can engender public confidence, and ensure that the judges who preside over electoral disputes are seen to be independent by the people, because they could be no better asset for the judiciary and for any country than public confidence that the people reposes in a judiciary. So among your roles as members of parliament is to ensure a playing field that is leveled, to ensure that electoral management bodies are independent. All that is part of the rule of law. And I know that SADC PF again has taken time, effort, resources to come up with SADC model law on elections that is actually consistent with the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance. It is therefore important, I submit, as part of your roles, to take all these pieces of model laws that are intended to promote the rule of law, and without any requirement for you to domesticate them as they appear, but at least to get the best parts of those laws that appeal to your relevant circumstances in your own country. In so doing, you'll be promoting constitutionalism and the rule of law. So that is in terms of very broad articulation of the issues implicated. Separation of powers. The professor spoke about separation of powers. It is your duty to ensure that there is separation of powers, meaning that you are determined to ensure that you don't rubber stamp anyone's decision, that you are the representative of the people, and to do so you need to be independent in word and in name. In word and in name. If the legislature is part of the appendage of the executive, the task that the professor spoke about, that you must ensure separation of powers, will never happen. And that in essence will be the betrayal of the aspirations of the voting masses of the people who take the MPs there in order to ensure that they play their role and they don't play second fiddle to anybody. But that will never happen until you assert your independence. Your independence therefore entails, in my view, that you must be totally independent from the executive or any other entity. And two, you must have your own budget. Parliament must have its own budget. It must not go begging to be funded by the executive. It must have its own research unit, its own legal division to advise it, to draft laws for it, to research in order to fulfill the constitutional mandate to follow the laws as part of constitutionalism and the rule of law. And of course, Professor, I'm trying to avoid introducing some controversy over who really should pass laws that govern us. I think it's admitted that is members of parliament, although of recent with the growth of judicial review, we're seeing judges passing laws. That may be a topic I'm throwing in, hoping that it can engender some discussion. Whether it is the legislature, the judges who must make laws, the answer may appear simple, but with the current exponential growth of judicial review, it may no longer be simple, and I have countless examples to cite, but time is not on our side. So by way of conclusion, Chair, I fully agree and endorse everything that the professor said. I adopt same as mine without seeking his authority. He already has no copyright over them, at least so far. But I go on to say that those thematic areas that I emphasized upon and the role of SADC PF and the policy recommendations that I made to assert your independence, including that your own staff, you must have your own staff that is hired by Parliament. Parliamentary staff must be hired and fired by members of Parliament, by Parliament as an institution. That speaks to the independence of Parliament that is required. That was a very quick overview in view of the time, and that constitutes my intervention, Madam Chair. I hope I'm still within time. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigada ao doutor Manduco e o juiz Dingake pela vossa apresentação. Passamos agora para a sessão de debate. Está aberta a sessão. Caros colegas, podemos participar do debate. Caros colegas, convido agora para o debate. Tivemos aqui duas apresentações. Está aberto agora a sessão. Por favor.
Madam Chair.
Sim. Sim. Sim, sim.
Okay, Madam Chair, you hear me?
Perfeitamente, perfeitamente. Seguir.
Okay. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. I'm Honorable Richard Labos. I see myself as one of the youngest honorable in the Africa. I'm 36 years old. I'm a young leader from the island of Seychelles. So I was listening with very carefully this morning regarding the presentation was held by the two honorable previously regarding the rule of laws and also between the parliament and the executive. But as a young African leader, sometimes I still asking myself about the way in Africa the process of democracy that's still going on. Well, like in Seychelles, our democracy is still a very young one at the moment. We just kick off with our second republic in 1993. So since then, we have 7 parliament elections. So that means I'm the 7th elected member from my constituent. So regarding the conversation regarding the rule of laws, and most of the time, especially in the continent, it's end up in conflicts. So my question in my mind now, so how voluntary or how honorable the African leaders have in their heart to try to resolve the conflict in a very democratic way. Like my country, we have been in only in one government since 1977 because we have a coup d'etat. And since 2020, we first have our first elected government, and I think it's the second time, or if I use that word correctly, that the Seychelles people has experience under the government. So that process was go well in a very, very, very well friendly manners. From previously, some people has been worried about how this solution will be, especially about a party who has been in power for 42 years. But frankly say, and I'm very happy to say that this process was going very smoothly and both sides has been understable and now the country is still going on. So again, the question remains for the young people in Africa now, especially the young parliament. So how sincere we are to make sure that we respect the rule of law, especially regarding practice.
Muito obrigado, caro colega. Mais intervenções? Tem a palavra deputado Dawene, Zimbabwe.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you very much to our very eloquent presenters, Professor Maduku and Justice Dingake. My question maybe could be directed to Professor Maduku on constitutionalism and rule of law. He has explained quite satisfactorily that a rule of law would be above constitutionalism because for you to adhere to your constitution, you have to be observing a rule of law. Let me go back to the process of crafting a constitution in every nation, it's quite cumbersome a process, really. I'm supposing in every nation in the SADC, where the public is involved almost 100% in coming up with a constitution. And then it's there's consultation, and then later on is subjected to a vote, and then the people vote for their constitution. So looking at a constitution of every nation, I personally feel at that particular juncture, it's a good constitution because the people say we have a constitution, they participate in making a constitution, they vote for it. Obviously, it's never voted 100%. There are people that will vote against the constitution, but then majority then decides that a particular country adopts a particular constitution. There we have a constitution in place for a country, and it has its provisions that have to be adhered to. Let me draw you closer to my country, Madam President. When you try and follow your constitution, good or bad, but you are trying to follow the constitution that has been adopted by the people. We have a section in our constitution, section 129, 1 subsection K, I think, on disqualification of members of parliament. The people, the constitution and the people, that means, agree that if a member ceases to be a member of a political party that elected him to parliament, and he decides to cross the floor whilst in parliament, he ceases or she ceases to be a member of parliament. It's provided for in the constitution. And like I said, I'm drawing you closer home to my situation. We have parties in Zimbabwe that are trying to use that section of the constitution to bring order within their party by recalling members from parliament. But then there comes the problem. Then there are some misgivings from the same political parties that then say, oh, this is unfair, there are some misgivings, this is wrong, this is not constitutional, this is a bad law. And I personally feel at that juncture, instead of this outcry, is it not best for people to clamor for a change of constitution than pointing fingers? Because the constitution is there and it's being used to the book. Well, legally, yes, the professor said there are bad laws, and if bad laws are being adhered to, they are not sanitized. But at this particular juncture, we are following the constitution. So my question where I need clarification is, can the constitution not be adhered to because of these cries? Or these people should direct their complaints on change of the constitution? Because as the constitution is, it's being adhered to, and parties are using that section of the constitution to recall their members. It's not the ruling party's fault that they are recalling each other. It's provided for in the constitution. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Muito obrigado, deputado Luene. Convido agora o Dr. Adam, nosso parceiro, por favor.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair. Good morning, Honorables. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Yeah, and I congratulate the two presenters. They are indeed my role models as far as this issue is concerned around SADC, and I always refer into their contribution they have made over the years. And thank you very much. And it is indeed a privilege to listen to you live, I would say, albeit via Zoom. My question is exactly related to what the Honorable Indiweni just mentioned, in particular with regard to over dominance of political parties in our political system. Over as the only avenue to a state and the decision-making organs, and in that, honorables, in whatever way they are elected, they are indeed under the mercy of the political parties. And all the recommendations that you have made and the analysis you presented, they are well placed. However, the reality that dominates our political systems are highly dominated by party loyalty. And in real terms, how do honorables or parliamentarians balance between the two? And this is my question, and I think recommendations to have some sort of practicability and a chance to be applied, it is good to refer to normative provisions and normative values, but at the end of the day, they have to come to the reality and respond to it. So I would like you to really put us into the picture. How do the parliamentarians balance between their constitutional responsibility for speaking, to speak for the people, to represent their constituency, but also at the same time become loyal to their political party? Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Muito obrigada, Dr. Adam. Lesotho, tem a palavra. Caro colega, Lesotho, tem a palavra.
Thank you, Honorable. I have a question here from both of them share the same capacity MPs. What can they say? Because in most countries, you'll find that the parliamentarians are not that educated. But at the same time, I expected to make quality laws and hold government accountable in every instance. So I'm just asking them, is it not going to help us if the standards are set for one to become a parliamentarian? I think, Honorable Chair, we as MPs, as our presenters have indicated, we have roles, and important roles for that matter, that of making laws, that of making government accountable. and that of representing our people. But at the same time, this means that we have to ensure that the executive doesn't allow violation of the Constitution by security agencies and other government departments. And in African countries, you'll find that this is the case. The security agencies are mostly used by the rulers to do whatever themselves do like, violating the law. So I'm really concerned about this issue. So I would like our presenters at least to say something on that. How can we solve that? Because it's really a problem in African countries. Having said that, Honorable Chair, thank you so much.
Obrigada, cara colega. Neste momento, quero convidar a Secretária-Geral a fazer uso da palavra.
Thank you very much, Chair. And let me join the committee in congratulating the presenters for that well laid out, I think, provocation on issues of constitutionalism and the rule of law. Mine is a brief question from a strategic perspective of the Secretariat. I've often got questions, at least from one or two parliaments, and they ask me, what are the priorities that we should carry forward in our constitutional review processes? And I also note that there are politics around constitutionalism, parliamentarism, among others. So could the two professors guide the Secretariat in terms of what are the current politics in constitutionalism, at least in the SADC region, so that we may begin to pursue those thematic issues and allow our members to engage on such? I thank you, Chair.
Muito obrigada, senhora Secretária-Geral. Pelos vistos, não temos mais pedido de palavra. E, neste momento, vou convidar aos nossos palestrantes, vão seguindo a sequência de como apresentaram, começando pelo doutor Maduco, para algumas considerações, para a resposta de algumas considerações que achar pertinente, e depois seguirá o doutor Dingak. Muito obrigada.
Madam Chair, yeah, it's now my time to respond.
Mas tenho aqui a indicação, parece que a Secretária-Geral queria falar, não sei se é...
Okay, it's Professor Madugu. Am I coming in? Do you want me to respond now?
Chairperson, the SG actually took the floor and asked the question.
Sim. Tá certo. Senhor secretário, pode falar?
In that petition,
Maduco, para seguir, parei porque vi que parecia que a indicação de que a secretária queria falar, mas não é o caso. Pode nos seguir, doutor.
It's Professor Maduka. I'm missing the point. Is it now my time to respond?
Hello.
Hello, Sokurasha.
Yes, Chair. Professor Maduk, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Please select English as the preferred language on the interpretation bar below, on the bar below, so that you will be able to hear the chairperson when the interpretation comes through.
Okay, that's fine.
Sure. You have done that?
Yeah, I've done that, yes.
Meanwhile, the chair has given you the floor to respond to the questions. So next time you will actually be able to pick interpretation.
I think I'll follow, because I wasn't following the chair, actually.
Apologies.
All right, so I can answer on the various questions that have been posed.
Sure.
Then I think I missed the Lesotho question. Would it be possible for the honorable member for Lesotho to just repeat a issue?
You prefer that being done now, or later on we can ask?
I think later on I will leave the question and then I deal with the others.
Lesotho, passa por favor.
All right, so I can come in now. Thank you, Chair, for the various questions that were posed, which I will try and answer. I'll go through. I think Justice Dingake will come in to deal with some of the issues that have been dealt with. I'll be fast. First, I think the honorable member from Seychelles raised a very important issue which ought to be covered by not just the SADC, PF, or SADC and so forth. We still have many countries in our region that would require assistance in trying to come to terms with following the Constitution or really empowering citizens to be able to participate in the democratic processes. I very much appreciate the intervention by Justice Dingake. It was very impressive for me. He did emphasize that under rule of law, you must take into account empowering citizens, ensuring that you have regular elections. And so what the position should be in terms of Seychelles, I think that there ought to be a specific program by the entire SADC to assist the political processes there. The SADC difficulty is that they always want to come in if there are problems, like, there are conflicts, that is not the only time you must come in, but you can come into nature a democracy just to build it up, to support the various steps that are taking place there. So I very much appreciate that, and this kind of platform or forum will enable our honorable member of parliament, who is a member of the committee, to also appreciate that they take lessons from here, try to spread them around in the different countries. But my position there is that the way forward would be for the entire Southern Africa to try and ensure that countries follow the position we have. Our SADC treaty, the treaty that brings the whole SADC together, ensures that in Article 4 there must be adherence to rule of law, democracy, constitutionalism. And it is a question of how we put elements to that and what does it mean. It will help us a lot in that regard. So I would answer it that way, that it's a very important observation. We need all of us to help in that. Then let me come to the second issue that was raised by our honorable member of parliament from our country, that's from Zimbabwe. That's the Honorable Ndiweni there. The question that he posed is a very important one, which is what do you do if the Constitution provides a particular thing and then we are following what the Constitution is saying? Can we simply be criticized for following the Constitution and then people don't follow what is there, or they should go on and seek an amendment of the constitution. He is very correct in saying that as long as the constitution is in place and is being followed, then that raises a question called constitutionality or legality. You must do what is in the constitution. But once you do what is in the constitution, you must not stop those who say that what is in the constitution is bad, or what is in the constitution is undemocratic, or what is in the constitution is unjust. They are not stopped from doing that. Follow the constitution, but also allow those who want to express themselves about what the constitution is doing. They won't stop the processes. What is provided for in the constitution must happen. But then it must also allow democratic process about amendment. What I would, if I take the Zimbabwean example that he has given, is very correct. He's very correct that those who are criticizing what is happening may actually be mistaken. They are criticizing the wrong situation. They must accept that there is a constitutional provision which allows what is happening to happen. And then they must blame the constitution and immediately push a program for its amendment. I know what is happening in the Zimbabwean context. They are failing to separate two things. Constitutionalism means that if a constitution is itself not good, you must push for its amendment. You don't just allow the constitution to remain and just say it's wrong. You fold your hands or you put your hands in the air and say it's wrong and end there. You must say that this is bad and let's change it. But you can't say it is bad, but I don't want the constitution to be changed. I mean, then you'll be contradicting yourself. So for the Honorable Ndiweni, you are correct. As long as the constitution is what it is, under the rule of law, we will go by the law as it stands. But immediately, if there is a strong feeling that that law is bad, we must have a program that changes the law. I think the Honorable Judge Dingake will tell you the problems that judges always face. They are faced with a law that is very unjust, but it will be the law for that being. The judge will say, look, I'm happy with this kind of law, but unfortunately my hands are tied. That's what some judge will say. I will follow the law, I will apply the law. But he will call upon, or he or she will call upon the legislative authorities and the public to attend to the changes that should happen to the law. So I think I've answered that. It doesn't confuse constitutionalism and rule of law. Constitutionalism still requires laws to be good, and that if laws are bad, they ought to be changed. And that if laws are bad, people must accept that those laws are bad, and they ought to be addressed as such. That would be my answer to the Honorable Ndiweni from Zimbabwe. Then there was a question that came which related to the reality in politics in Africa or in Southern Africa, that political parties tend to control what their MPs say in Parliament, and that most members of Parliament will go by what their political parties say, and that they will not do anything which is not by their party. So there is always a conflict between what the political parties will be saying and what may be right or good. So the question is, what do I do if I'm placed between a political party that says one thing and then what is good on the other? Well, that is a personal decision to be made by a particular politician. And for us as people addressing this meeting, it would be very sad for a politician not to do what is right and simply do that which is dictated by their political party because the political party says that's what ought to be done. If the political party tells you to do something which is very, very wrong, then I believe that in every constitution, it might not be put across directly, but a member of parliament who is a politician must have what we call a conscience. They must have a conscience there. They must know that certain things are wrong. And you cannot do certain things simply because they are dictated by someone. A person must not go to parliament to be a rubber stamp, to be a tool for others. I will do it because my political party says I must do it. There might be times when people have to separate their ways from their political parties, depending, of course, on the political system. But if a member of parliament chooses to go all the way and every time go by their political party, That will be their political choice. Sometimes it can work for them as persons, but it will not work for the entire society. These are just our personal views, but every constitution contemplates a situation where members of parliament are individuals who are guided by what is right and ultimately do what is dictated by their conscience. And I will advise that that be the proper way to do, or you try and engage your political superiors in your political party. You argue with them for them to see why it might not make sense to go in a particular way. I've seen so many instances across the world and also in Southern Africa where members of political parties ultimately vote in a given way, which is not necessarily what their political parties say. If you do it in the right way, you earn a lot of respect, and then it gives the political system much substance. Now, as I close on that point, I have not come across a constitution in Southern Africa. Any of all our constitutions, and I'm saying this from really a position of having gone through the constitution, no constitution gives authority to a political party to tell an MP what to do. In fact, the political party, yes, sponsors your election to parliament. There is a party whip who may be telling you what to do. But the constitution works on the basis that each member of parliament is an individual with a mind and with an interest in the interests of the people. And that the political parties must know that the members of parliament there, society relies on the good will and the good judgment of the individual political member and not the individual political party. That would be my response to that. I can always come back to those. Then, Madam Chair, I did miss the question from Lesotho. I missed that question. So I would be really, if possible, give the Lesotho person just to repeat the question so that I could answer it. So I will stop there. I haven't answered the question from Lesotho. I missed it a bit and so on. So if I could hear that question. Thank you.
Allow me, Chairperson. Honorable, yes, the request from Professor Madu is for the Member of Parliament from Lesotho to repeat your question.
Muito obrigado. Convido-lhe agora para voltar a repetir a sua pergunta, deputado Lesotho.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair. I was saying that as MPs, we have some roles as our presenters have indicated. The role of making laws and that of holding governments accountable and that of representing our people. And as I said, this means that as MPs, we have to ensure that the executive doesn't allow violation of the Constitution by security agencies and other government departments. So my question is here. In most cases, you'll find that the security agencies in our countries are misused by people in power. That if one doesn't want to step down, he asks for security agencies to back up him so that he remains in power. So I'm saying, what can our presenter say in this case? Because it has been realized that this is the problem in African countries mostly. So what can he say about this? That is my question. Another one is the rule of law to exist in our region. Parliamentarians and government must sensitize people about the laws and their role and responsibilities as parliamentarians. But in most cases, you'll find that the people do not understand clearly what are the roles of MPs in their country. So much that you'll find that they are expecting too much for petty things, one can say, from MPs. So I'm a little worried about the civic education which could be held for the people in a country. How can we approach this? How can he help us to at least to make our people to understand clearly what the role of the MPs is in our country? Thank you very much, Honorable Chair.
Okay.
Muito obrigada, cara colega. Vejo a mão também do colega de Madagascar. Acho que tem uma questão a apresentar. Por favor.
Oui. D'abord, je tiens à vous... c'est un honneur pour participer dans cet forum parlementaire du SADC, député Siliva de Madagascar. Donc, mesdames et messieurs, bonsoir. En fait, j'aimerais souligner juste une grande ligne qu'il faut mettre en place à propos pour mettre en place le nationalisme et l'état de droit et le rôle de chaque parlement pour le rôle constitutionnel. En fait, on m'entend là? On m'entend? Est-ce que tout le monde m'entend? Vous m'entendez, cher honorable?
Yes, honorable member. Yes, honorable member. The members can hear you.
D'accord. Donc, avant de mettre en place l'état de droit, il faut que chaque personne, chaque individu, en tant que membre du Parlement, soit convaincu, et il faut que tous les membres du Parlement savent leur raison d'être en tant que Parlement. Donc, en tant que membre de la SADC, il faut qu'on mette en place une vague de conscientisation de chaque membre, de leur rôle, de leur devoir en tant que membre du Parlement. Et ça demande vraiment une communication parce qu'il s'agit de conscientisation de chaque membre. Juste une petite remarque vient de Madagascar parce que allô, attends. Donc, pour promouvoir vraiment le nationalisme et l'état de droit et le rôle constitutionnel des membres du Parlement, à mon avis, ça commence par soi-même, par le membre du Parlement. Il faut que chaque membre connaisse bien son devoir envers sa nation. Et ça, il faut mettre une stratégie de communication pour conscientiser chaque membre. Merci, Madame la Présidente et tous les chers honorables.
Obrigado, caro colega. Essa é a questão. Ouvido os nossos palestrantes para
Okay, I can start, Madam Chair, by continuing with the answers I was giving, and I think Justice Dingake will then come in. I will begin with the question from Lesotho, which I have now fully captured and understood. They are very, very good questions, in the sense that they raise very serious issues. And I think those are the issues that are the reason for us having such kind of a forum or such kind of really a workshop or a discussion. The first issue relates to security agencies that may actually not be following any law or following the Constitution. And then people in government or leaders who then rely on the security agencies to be able to undermine the Constitution. In other words, go against the rule of law, go against the constitutionalism. Yet members of parliament, their role is to represent the people. So how best do we deal with such a situation and so forth? Obviously, it is very, very bad. It is contrary to the rule of law. It is contrary to constitutionalism for members of the security agencies, this is the army or the police, to be a law above the law. That's what they will be doing. Constitutionalism and rule of law mean that we are all within the law. We are all subject to law, and that we must be governed by law. So if you have situations like that, that is not correct, that is wrong, and that we must all speak out against that. We must all be able to say, this is wrong. But then if we say it is wrong, where do we go and what do we do? There are various things that can be done by members of parliament or individual members of parliament to deal with those situations. Obviously, the first one is to speak out, whether as individual MPs or in parliament, to condemn whatever we'll be doing, through your motions and so on. But there's also a role that some members of parliament are not taking, which is the role of going to a court if people do things contrary to law, which are of such a serious nature. You must make sure that your courts get involved. If a person is a member of parliament, they automatically, somewhat, in many legal systems, they have a right to appear in a court and to raise an issue, which we call locus standi. They have a right to appear before a court. So an individual member of parliament can actually petition the highest court in that country. I'm sure there will be a court that will deal with the constitutional issues just to support the Constitution or vindicate the Constitution. So a member of parliament who is now well schooled with all these things we are discussing must be courageous enough and be an example by actually making the courts get involved for a start. Only if the courts are overwhelmed, like if you think this is wrong, you must first exhaust the process of going to a court within your country. And then if a court makes a decision which is favorable to the rule of law or constitutionalism, then so be it. Let's see how that decision is respected. If the decision is not respected, then we play political way. We appeal to the SADC heads of states, we appeal to the SADC machinery for purposes of ensuring that there is security there. The SADC organ on politics and defense and so on must actually be the organ that deals with constitutionalism and rule of law. So we can invoke these mechanisms, but first let's exhaust by the framework of going to a court within our country. That takes me to the second issue from Lesotho on the rule of law and sensitizing people about the role of MPs. She is very correct that our people don't know what MPs are supposed to do. They would think that the MP is supposed to be ensuring that we have small projects in our areas. The MP is able to build a road or build a clinic the MP, things like that. These are things that government must do. The MPs are the voice of the people to ensure that government goes into these projects, not for the MP as an individual to do this. So how do we get people? People must know it. First, they must know it from the MPs themselves. The MPs must tell people what their role is. You should tell people, look, you are coming to me for this, but you should know this is for the government. I'll take it up. But if they come to you and you are the one who is now trying to provide the blankets or provide, the medicine direct from your pocket, from your well-wishers, then the MPs are contributing to a state of affairs where people misunderstand the role of an MP. So it must start from the MPs themselves to start telling people what exactly is expected or what the role of an MP is. Now, if MPs are afraid of not being elected next time, and then they actually go along with the people's ignorance of the role of the MPs, then our problem deepens, and then it keeps going on. And I think that is one. Then the second second way is to have civil society get empowered and tell people what it is. You need conscientization from civil society to be able to deal with that. So we should call upon civil society people to tell people what MPs. Then I think the best avenue of telling people what MPs are supposed to do should come from the government itself. It must tell people what MPs are supposed to do, and then tell people that it is its role, only that it is failing or that it will do that with time and so forth. That's how I will attend to the process from what has come out of Lesotho. Then from the observations made from Madagascar, I agree entirely with the observation that everything must start with the member of parliament himself or herself. And then once members of parliament understand what ought to happen about these issues, rule of law or constitutionalism, then it will be much better. Those are my answers. I think that Justice Dingake can then come in to take up the other aspects that he might want to respond to. Thank you, Chair.
Muito obrigada. Doutor Juiz Dingake.
Is it my turn now to... Thank you so much. Am I clear that side? You can hear me?
Yes,
Hello?
Judge.
Okay. Thank you so much. There have been many questions answered. Many of them actually were suitable to be answered by the professor than me, and he has answered them quite correctly and eloquently. I will start not in any order. I try to encompass the ones that I noted here. I could relate, I could understand the tension, the difficulty between loyalties to affiliated political vehicles, to the Constitution, and to caucuses, the impediments that arise sometimes. But all I could say is that in some of these assignments, especially being a member of parliament, is not very different from being a judge, because you ought to bring character, courage, objectivity, honesty to play, and you ought to be true to yourself, sometimes at great cost, especially in the African continent. But the job has to be done. That of being an independent player, executing the constitutional mandate. In other words, what I'm saying is that I appreciate and understand the difficulty sometimes between a party constitution and all other things. But I say that it's actually very important to be true to yourself. It needs a transformed mindset. We need a transformed mindset. We need a new generation of MPs who can be true to their call and to try to follow what they're supposed to do without fear of favor. After all, that is what they are required to do. You see, I often say, Madam Chair, that a constitution is just a promissory note. It's a set of promises. It promises constitutionalism, the rule of law, good governance. It promises the marginalized rights, respect and promotion of rights, the vulnerable. It promises them equality before the law, non-discrimination. But we know the reality. The reality on the ground is that notwithstanding these promises, we continue to discriminate unfairly against members of key populations, the disabled, those living and affected by HIV. We continue to enforce laws that are contrary to good order and good governance of our countries. But even where constitutions empower us to do that, we don't have the courage and the ability to do it. So we need some transformed mindsets in order to transform these promissory notes called constitutions, to breathe life into them. That challenge is of course not only for MPs, it's also for civil society and for us as ordinary citizens to do our part. Until such time that we can do that, will not make much progress. That was by way of answering in the manner consistent to the station I occupy. That is how far I can frame the challenge around divided loyalties. And of course, we have a legal framework where the separation of powers that we talked about as a feature of the rule of law, that the professor emphasized, and I agree with him, that you need to ensure as MPs that there is separation of powers, is often then made difficult by the legal framework in our different countries. In some countries, the separation of powers is very loose. You have MPs who are members of the executive. It's a very loose separation of powers where an MP is also a member of cabinet, a member of the executive. Often one of the functions has to suffer as a result. The question may then arise in that particular country, depending on the circumstances and wishes of the people, whether that arrangement is worth pursuing or we need a total separation of powers. And if that is the broad sentiment of the people, that they need a broad separation of powers in which a member of parliament can't be in cabinet because of separation of powers, then that is when then we need then to reform the constitution to ensure that we indeed have separation of powers that we require depending on the circumstances of each country. But that could be a challenge. I emphasize again what Professor said. In most of our constitutions, actually, members of parliament have what is called free mandate system. They're sent into parliament as individuals and not as party members. In fact, I often say in my own country, in Botswana, the constitution does not mention, the word political party doesn't feature at all. I think even in the Electoral Act, the political party doesn't feature at all. Is the candidate, the individual that features. That then tells you where the primacy is put. So that is my general comment on that. Madam Secretary General asked about what are the priorities that we should carry forward in the constitutional review process. And permit me, Chair, to put this contextual caveat, which I did last week when I had occasion at a similar meeting to say. But this question requires me to do that. I think SADC PF has done extremely well. They have done extremely well to guide MPs over time on certain priority areas that they may have determined, many of which I have mentioned, such as ending child marriage, which is a huge problem, impacting on violation of human rights, issues of the rights of those who have HIV, and issues of free and fair elections. I've emphasized all those things. The real challenge, Madam Secretary General, as I have often said, is of course that SADC PF is still in a state of evolution. And the challenge towards moving to a supranational board with full legislative powers is going to take time. We don't know how much time. What I've seen over time is that there's some dissonance or some maybe not reading from the same page with the executive, while as the members of parliament over time have embraced some of the work that SADC-PF has done, the executives do not seem to have been as keen. I say that point to say that may be one area you must prioritize, meaning how do you ensure that the executive who wield the power to make the modern laws work, how do you ensure that they own the products that are passed by members of parliament? So I think strategically you need to move around also engaging members of the executive. It will take you to be a tall order. It will take you sometimes. I think I'll congratulate you one day you bring a summit of heads of states. It's a good idea to consider, Madam SG, and try to revisit what the MPs have endorsed and ask the question, how can they help to advance these good ideas, and tell them that these ideas are consistent with the AU Constitutive Charter, with the AU Human Rights Charter, with the international human rights instruments that they've signed. That, in other words, is not something out of that which they don't agree, and say, how can you help us? If that day comes, Madam Secretary General, you may find that a lot of the work that you have done over time, even if it is not taken on board the whole of it, some fraction of it may be able to be carried forward, because until such time we bring on board those who have the power to make things happen, we may then still have do things that we find difficult to implement. I've said in the past that over the years, the quality of the interventions of SADC-PF has been quite progressive. I have even said that sometimes it may well be that it's living ahead of its time. But we need to bring the executive on board. Earlier when I started, I said some of the challenges, the contextual and political environment under which SADC-PF operates is uneven, characterized by advances and retreats in democratization, including in some instances regression. And negotiating these tensions and twists requires, Madam Secretary General, some work in diplomacy. That is one of them. Other areas that I may suggest to you, of course, is awareness. I think you need to develop some program in which you can. It has been raised before, but I emphasize it because I think it's handy and it's doable. Develop some program, some crash course, in which you can take through members of parliament around some of the things that we discussed. What is their role, basically, in passing legislation, and all the elements that Professor beautifully traversed. I think a crash course will work. A road show may also work, in terms of trying to promote among the community that you serve in SADC, that they too must be brought on board, because there's no point in just maybe equipping or capacitating MPs. And I think if you sensitize their communities about the role of parliament in promoting human rights, the rule of law, constitutionalism, the rights of the most vulnerable and the marginalized, the disabled, women and children, you may find some traction and you may find some democratic legitimacy out of that kind of exercise. There is also the issue of the independence of parliament. It's big. It's not happening. I don't know what needs to be done around that, but it should be one of our priorities, including of our judiciaries. And lastly, the institutions that support democracy seem to be weak generally and not independent. I have in mind your public protector's office, the electoral management bodies, the anti-corruption bodies. Most of them sometimes in some jurisdictions lack the independence to be relevant and to be credible and to have buy-in of the people. So that is that. Otherwise, the rest of the other questions have been answered. I wanted just to highlight some of those things. If there was time, I wanted to speak about corruption because it's part of the rule of law. Part of the reason why economic development is not reaching the people, why hospitals are not being built, schools are not being built, drugs are not being brought into our clinics and hospitals, books are not being bought for students, and many other things, has to do with corruption. In itself, bad governance. A lot of money has been siphoned out, illicit financial deals and everything, has deprived the ordinary person about the dignity, the human right, just the dignity to survive, the right to public health, the right to education, the right to work, and many other things. Yet, one of the priorities next, Madam Secretary General, since you asked, I think is to not just talk about corruption. I know that the AU has a convention on corruption. And the extent to which it has been useful, it's a matter of debate. But it's one of the things that you may wish to attend as a matter of urgency, because corruption is ruining our countries, our democracy, the rule of law, constitutionalism, and everything. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Zimbabwe.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I think it's a supplementary question which I intended to ask, but I think I overlooked it. It's directed to Professor Maduku. Professor Maduku eloquently and broadly put the roles of Parliament. He split them into four. He said the primary role would be ensuring separation of powers as number one role. The second role, he put it down as the legislative role. The third role, he put down as performing exclusive constitutional duties. And the fourth role, he put down as oversight, which is monitoring and the accountability role. My question to the professor is, out of those four listed roles, where does representation come in? Because the people that we represent mainly are interested in you representing them in Parliament. So where does he slot representation in those four roles? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Muito obrigada. Cai a questão.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will answer it. It's a very interesting question, Madam Chair, very interesting question, in the sense that Honorable Ndiweni there says the representation role, where does it fit in those four? Very interesting. In fact, I will take a note of it for my students in the university. Actually, the representation role is for all those four places. In other words, you are representing the people when you ensure that there is separation of powers. You are representing the people when you are involved in legislation. You are representing the people when you play each of those exclusive constitutional roles, vote of no confidence, impeachment, and whatever. You are representing the people on four when you then do, the oversight and so on. So it's an interesting, very important question, Madam Chair, and I think I've answered it. do not put the representation role as a separate, stand-alone thing. It is because you represent the people. That is why Parliament must ensure that there is separation. It is the people saying, go out there, make sure that separation of powers remains. That's what the people are saying to you as an MP. Please, please ensure that we have separation of powers. So it's the voice of the people saying separation of powers. When you go to make laws, it is the people represent us, make the law on our behalf. And then, if you feel that the government is not to exercise your power, vote of no confidence, impeach the president, all those things, and in fact the oversight. I think I've answered him. He must be satisfied now, I think.
Thank you very much, Prof. Because all along, people think representation is representing well, I understand when you are putting it that way, that all the four roles you are representing the people. But people have always had this notion that there is a standalone part that you play, whereby if they need a dam in their area, you represent their needs there and present it to Parliament as a separate role. But I understand your explanation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. In fact, also, I should say through the Madam Chair that it was important that your supplementary question be put, because we as parliamentarians, we are representatives, but representatives in a broad range of issues, and that your persons and the constituents must not narrow your representation to the dam and so on. They must say, look, yes, I will represent you to call for the government to bring in dams and bring in this. But I am also representing you to ensure that there is separation of powers. I am also representing you to ensure that there is rule of law, so that they don't turn around and think that when the MP is fighting hard for rule of law, constitutionalism, and so on, the MP has abandoned us, or he or she is now involved in this. Well, people call those petty. Yet those are the primary issues. For there to be dams and so forth, there must be rule of law and constitutionalism. And that is the way to go.
Muito obrigado. Chegamos a esta hora, o término dos trabalhos desta manhã. Convido agora o secretário para alguns anúncios para este período. Por favor.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. There is no announcement save for indicating that we resume at 2. When we resume at 2, let's be on time, because this is a live broadcast. And also, let's be on time. Over to you, Chair.
Muito obrigado, Sr. Secretário. Vamos interromper para o nosso almoço. Retomaremos quando forem 10 para as 14. Muito obrigada e bom apetite a todos, colegas. Até logo.
We are free to exit and re-log in. So we'll ask the host to terminate the meeting.